Okay, good. So, Martin Thomson, I work in the office of the CTO at Mozilla, and I'm responsible for a lot of the security things that you will see in web push, as well as the protocol, um, and a bunch of other security things. I spend a lot of my day-to-day work on the TLS stack in Firefox, and I continually hear this message. And I'm going to explain to you tonight why it's true. So I like this quote. This is a paraphrase from someone I know, Brian Sniffen, who works at Akamai on their security infrastructure, and it is basically the truth. The whole purpose of security is to identify these situations where things would work, and make them stop working. And as application developers, that's an unpleasant reality that you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And that's actually something you will be confronted with if you start using web push as well. I'm responsible for the security there as well. I believe there's fruit in the other room if you want to throw it. If you want to send a payload, there's a number of hoops that you're going to need to jump through in order to make sure that the payload is encrypted, authenticated, and all those other wonderful things. And if you don't jump through those hoops, we're not going to deliver the message. Sorry. So truth number one is HTTPS is slow. And this is true for a number of reasons. So when you connect to a site and you want to set up this TLS connection, it takes some time. You spend some time just exchanging messages with the server saying what you want to do, what crypto you want to use, making sure that the server is actually the server that you intended to talk to in the first place, and you burn a bunch of CPU. And you'll see a bunch of people suggest that, oh, this is nothing. Don't worry about this. You know, we've got ways around this. To a certain extent, they're right, but you will see, is TLS fast yet.com? I think some of the folks I know at Google maintain this site that advertises the fact that TLS is not actually that slow and it costs them basically nothing to run on Google servers, and they're absolutely right. It doesn't actually cost them a whole lot of CPU, but it does cost them time, and we'll see later that that's actually quite relevant. Probably one of the most important truths here is that running HTTPS is expensive, and it's expensive for a bunch of obvious reasons, and also for a bunch of kind of mundane reasons that turn out to be far more relevant than the obvious ones. So the most obvious one that people think of is you need to go to a CA and buy a certificate. Sure, spend your $10, fine. The biggest cost I find is that when you run something like HTTPS, it has a maintenance cost associated with it. You have to renew your certificate every year. You have to make sure that you have the latest version of OpenSSL installed, otherwise you're vulnerable to whatever it is that's wrong with it this month. And in certain circumstances, you do actually need extra servers for the added load. It's going to depend a lot on what it is that you do. As Google said, it costs them something like 1% is the tax. At least that's what Adam Langley claims, and I believe him. They do a lot of other things on their servers, and all the crypto stuff is actually a very small proportion of that. Probably the most relevant one for the discussion this evening is that it's mandatory. If you want all the benefits of web push, if you want all the benefits of service workers, you're going to be doing HTTPS. I am not aware of anyone who is brave nor stupid enough to implement service workers in clear text. And there's a number of good reasons for this, primarily being that if you're going to implement and deploy something that has this sort of persistence property, you want to make sure that it's actually the same site that you're talking to every time that you have that conversation with the site. Otherwise, some rather interesting scenarios arise. I don't know if people are aware of Fire Sheep, which is the wonderful coffee shop attack, where you sit in the coffee shop next to someone and see what they're doing on Facebook. That is no longer possible, thanks to the fact that Facebook has deployed HTTPS, but they're ahead of the curve on this one. Not a lot of sites do that. So the brutal truth here is that HTTP URLs are now ineffectively extended support, by which I mean, yes, they will continue to work. They will probably continue to work indefinitely, but we're not making any guarantees on that front. Anyone running XP in the room? So I recently changed banks, and it's an unpleasant experience to walk into the bank branch and be given instructions on entering your password onto their nice machine sitting there, and to see that it's running XP. That was true in both banks, so I'm not sure that there's a lot that we can do about that. But this is essentially the same sort of situation we're in. Yes, it will continue to sort of hobble by, and people will be able to buy support for it on an ongoing basis. But my expectation is that at some point you will find it untenable to continue to run a site on HTTP. Most sites will be sort of reduced to a redirect on port 80. And this is probably not news to anyone, but expect new features to require HTTPS, even if it doesn't really have any strong motivation for it. So we're talking about web speech synthesis this afternoon, and this is a new thing that's recently landed in Firefox, and you should expect to see it in the next 12 to 18 weeks. And that may be an API that would require HTTPS. I don't believe it does, but those are the sorts of things that are starting to get tagged with the must-have HTTPS. So, we're all kind of screwed, right? So I looked at on the HTTP archive. These are the trends over the past few years. That's only a short amount of time, I think you'll find. But you're seeing websites getting bigger. You're seeing websites being distributed over more and more servers. That means more and more TCP connections. That means more and more TLS connections involved. That means more and more crypto overhead. That means more connections. It means more time spent doing things that you didn't really, that don't actually contribute to you actually getting the performance that you want. And more and more things that mean that you have to go in, change your TLS configuration, understand whether you're vulnerable to the latest and greatest attack, and install new software and all those sorts of other things. Anyone updated glibc in the past little while? I hope everyone who's running it has been updating glibc in the past little while. At least anyone who's making DNS queries. This is a continuing and an ongoing cost of running services. I'm not sure that I have an answer for this, unfortunately, but we have some answers for the other things. And there's lots and lots of work involved in making sure this all works. I just love this quote from the Twitter blog that explains how easy it is to set up perfect forward secrecy on Twitter. And if anyone here thinks that they can read that and go off and do it on their servers with some reasonable guarantee that it's going to work, I'd like to come and talk to you, because we have an interest in making sure that this is possible, and we'd like to see someone actually implement a library and open source it and make it available to people to do this, because this is an unpleasant thing to be asking someone to do. So, we understand all of these things. I don't think that anyone in the security community is in denial of some of these problems that I'm talking about here. The PR story has been a little bit different, but in reality, we all understand that there's a number of significant hurdles and things that are real pain points. And so what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this is what we're doing to make the situation a little bit better for people. And so I think performance is probably one of the biggest complaints that we hear about HTTPS. Simple interaction with developers I have on a regular basis is, why don't you put an S in that URL? Well, isn't that slower? And so maybe it's not. So some of the tricks are easy. And if you look at the isTLSfastYet.com website, you will find that there's a number of very simple tricks that you can do. So if anyone knows how to acquire themselves an ECDSA certificate, they can make some pretty good inroads on their server load. If anyone's worried about the cost of symmetric crypto, it would be interesting. We could have a conversation about that, but my understanding is that if you're doing it right, the cost is basically zero. If you're running on Intel and you're doing AES, doing crypto and doing a mem copy are about the same. Cycles per byte, you're paying less than 1 cycle per byte of information transferred. This is not true for everyone. So there was a recent announcement from Netflix that they're doing HTTPS for the video. They had to jump through some pretty significant engineering hurdles to make that possible. And they have new mods for the BSD kernels that they're running, and they've done some pretty amazing engineering work to make that happen. I believe they've open sourced that, so you can do it if you want to jump through some of the same hoops. But for most people, if you're actually doing any work on your servers other than just shifting bits, the costs are basically zero. Unfortunately, the BBC, when I talk to them, they shift too much video. This is not true for them. So this is not true for everyone, but generally speaking, it's true. So to give you an idea, these are the sorts of costs that you're looking at. I picked 2 CPUs off the graph here at the site there. Great resource if you're interested in performance and crypto, but that's by the by. It's also served over HTTP and HTTPS, but the cert doesn't work. We'll get into that later. But you'll see here that if you're doing RSA, which most people I think will be, you're paying a lot of time to do that work. Now, you're probably not doing signing on one of these, and that's a good thing because that long bar is really not the one that you want. But that's 15 milliseconds, and that's pretty intolerable. You're not going to get very many connections terminated at that point. But what's more interesting there is that if you want to transfer a megabyte, then it actually starts getting relevant to a mobile user. Taking up the anomalous readings here, you can actually see that verification of an RSA signature is cheap. And so what you're doing by switching to ECDSA is shifting some of the load from the server. The server gets a great win, and the clients actually pay quite a bit in order to do that. Speaking as a client developer, I don't care. The number of connections that we actually establish on the client is pretty low. And so we don't care too much about paying in the order of, even in the worst case here, 2 milliseconds to verify. So don't concern yourself with making that change. It will save you a lot of money on your servers, particularly if you're terminating a lot of connections. What's even more promising is that we're getting better crypto. And this is going to make a big difference to these graphs. I don't have the numbers here, but Char Poly 1305, Alphabet Soup. Alphabet Soup version 1 will make your transfer of bytes that much more efficient on mobile devices. I believe it's in the order of half the cost for a mobile device. It turns out that CPU is actually a fairly relevant cost on a mobile device, unfortunately. And we're doing some new key exchange and signing algorithms that will mean that you can do batch verification, which will get those costs right down. It's something like a quarter to a tenth of the CPU cost, depending on a whole bunch of things. But spending CPU we're talking about saving half a millisecond here, half a millisecond there. It's not really going to make all that much of a difference to someone who's sitting on the other end of a 300 millisecond round trip. I live in Australia. Most of the services that I talk to happen to be in the States. I enjoy somewhere between 300 and 350 milliseconds round trips on things. That puts me rather firmly in the bad end. In fact, I'm off the graph on the RTT chart here, which means that I suffer terrible page load times as a result. And what you can see here, this is work that Belshi did a few years ago, and he discovered that you can increase the bandwidth to someone's site. And it actually makes very little difference. But if you increase the latency, then you really start to pay. And where that becomes most relevant is all this handshaking that we do between the servers and the clients. So you have a server that's wasting all of these round trips doing TLS handshakes and TCP setup and all those sorts of other wonderful things, and you're paying it at very high round trip times. That really starts to eat into your page load times. You can, at 350 milliseconds, I'm lucky to get the title of a page in less than a second. In fact, I'm not sure that's even possible in most cases. DNS, TCP, TLS, we're done. So, some of the things that we're doing to improve that. HTTP 2. So, multiplexing there is a huge, huge win. We do the handshake once, and then we send all of our requests over the same connection. You pay the upfront cost, and then you run that sunk cost down, and requests cost essentially nothing. Of course, in order to make full advantage of that, you need to make sure that your requests are small because you're pumping them all down the same pipe. And we compress the headers so that makes it possible to send lots of requests without worrying too much about the cost. I can talk about the limitations of that if anyone's interested. But generally speaking, that makes a huge, huge advantage. And then we have server push. I'm not seeing a lot of evidence that sites are using push, but server push is the answer to inlining. And if anyone's familiar with the performance technique for inlining, you take all of your stuff, you glom them all together, and you send one response back. You don't have to wait for the client to make another request. You just send them everything they need all at once. Now, the problem with that is you get terrible cache coherency. If any one thing in that enormous blob changes, you have to send the entire enormous blob back down again. You can't rely on caching for any parts of it that might be constant between visits. Maybe your JS hasn't changed. Maybe all of your CSS is relatively static. Maybe you've got a bunch of images that you might want to use. All of that, server push allows you to do effectively that without much of the downside. But you have to be using HTTP 2 and HTTP 2 clients. Good news there is that HTTP2 is supported by just about every browser currently. There are some things in HTTP2 that you will find you were doing with HTTP 1.1 that are now inadvisable. And I think that there's an O'Reilly book that I've seen floating around that talks about some of those limitations. I recommend Ilya's book. It's pretty good. I didn't see that one this evening, but there's a bunch of tips in there about how to deal with spriting and inlining, sharding, and the various techniques that people use to sort of optimize for server push and HTTP2. Interesting example. This one's a contrived example. I believe this one is the Gopher tiles one, which is part of the HTTP2 demo in Go. On the left, you can see HTTP 1.1. On the right, you can see HTTP 2. What's interesting, I think, here is that once you get the first few requests out on HTTP 1.1, all the other requests get backed up. They don't have a connection they can go on. They have to wait for the responses to the initial requests before they can actually be sent to the server. So they just sit there doing nothing. And as a result, you only get 6 of them out at a time, and you have to wait for a whole round trip before you can get the next batch of 6 out, and then you 6, 6, 6. Whereas with HTTP 2, you just send all the requests. As you get them, you send them all. And as a result, you're getting responses back in parallel. Now, it's not clear what sort of optimizations are happening on the server here, but it's definitely faster. And you'll find that as time goes by, it gets even better. The demo page has something like 500 images or something that it downloads, all in a great big tile. And I've seen results anywhere as good as 5-second difference between the HTTP 1.1 and HTTP 2 example. So this weekend, I'm going to a conference where we're going to talk about TLS 1.3, and this is actually really exciting for me. So there's a bunch of advantages, but the ones that are kind of most relevant here is that if you've been to a site before, you don't pay any latency cost for TLS. You have a request to send, you send the request immediately. That, to me, is probably the most interesting thing. But there's a bunch of other things. So all the privacy people love the fact that TLS 1.3 will be encrypted as soon as possible and encrypt everything that it can. And they also like the fact that it's a much simpler protocol. We threw out a bunch of things that we didn't like anymore. And it is therefore much easier for the cryptographers to analyze the protocol and tell us that it's actually good. And so that hopefully will mean that in the future you will find fewer instances of the whoops, we forgot that such and such a feature in combination with such and such a feature caused this great hole to appear. But I think the most interesting one here is this latency thing. If you look at a standard connection setup, you get something like this. You have a TCP handshake, you have a TLS handshake, which in its full form currently is 2 round trips to the server. And then finally, you get to send your request message. So that's essentially 3 round trips of dead air. Nothing's happening, you're just, and I haven't even included the DNS request in this. So if you're sitting on the other end of a 300 millisecond round trip, as most of the world does, you live in San Francisco, you might enjoy a 50 millisecond or even a 20 millisecond round trip time to a server. Consider yourself privileged. Most of the rest of the world has to deal with this, and they actually notice. I heard reports from India that this round trip time is something over a second in some networks, particularly mobile networks. When you get packet loss, it really starts to pile up. Generally speaking, you're going to get this if you've configured your server correctly. That means that you have the latest version of OpenSSL that does TLS 1.2. You have a good cipher suite. You've turned on the perfect forward secrecy option. You will get this where we cheat and we send the request along with the sort of tail end of the connection optimistically in the hopes that we're not under attack. If we're under attack, bad things happen, but that's fine. As an interesting stat, we get almost 70% of our connections in Firefox look like this, which means that you're paying a round trip over normal HTTP for that. That's not too bad. This is what TLS 1.3 will look like the first time you talk to a server. That's the same as the false start one. It's not too bad. This is what it's going to look like when you come back a second time. And this is what's exciting for me, is that now HTTPS and HTTP will have parity. And this, I think, for people who are interested in performance, is pretty exciting. We have a number of tricks that we're talking about that will allow it to be something less than that as well, in the case where you aren't returning to a site. But that's going to get kind of interesting. This is what we want to see in the future. And this is the promise of Quick. Yay. As Adam Langley says, don't implement Quick. It's changing all the time. But very soon now we're going to see something like this. And this is where it really gets exciting, because you can have your request out to the server before the server even knows about you. And all it has to do is sift through this request and do that. Again, this will be for return visits only. It won't be the first time. So we have a number of optimizations that we need to look into. But we may be able to get down to one round trip for initial visits with some hacks. And we're exploring those. So that covers kind of the mathematical problems that we have with running HTTPS. But the fact is, most of the cost of running HTTPS is actually the operational cost. It's the constant maintenance of your server to make sure that it doesn't break and that you have to have updated certificates and updated software and all those sorts of other wonderful things. So late last year, a bunch of companies, including Mozilla, launched this Let's Encrypt thing. I'm sure that lots of people have heard about this. I hope that people have actually tried this out. I was told that some people in the audience have, and it worked pretty well for them. The idea here being that this is open, transparent certificate authority that will issue certificates to anyone for free. Great. Okay, so now your $6 certificate costs nothing. Whoop-de-doo. But the big advantage here is that we're trying to remove the operational cost involved with getting certificates and getting yourself set up. And the key to that is automation. So we have and are working on a new open protocol for talking to certificate authorities. There's now more clients than I can actually list that support this protocol. There's servers being released now that have the protocol built into them, as well as a bunch of tools that talk the protocol and can configure your servers with certificates. And the essence of this is the entire process is automated. You install the software does whatever magic is necessary to prove to the CA that you own that particular domain name and acquires a certificate for you, then installs it in your server. And ultimately, what we're going to see is that you install Apache and you just tell it what name you want, and it magically provides a certificate for you. If you want a special certificate from someone because you like the EV certificates with the nice green box with your company name in it, fine, off you go. But you'll have a baseline of security that is much, much better than HTTP. Good news here, it's available. They are in beta, which means that everyone can come and use it. I've never really understood the distinction between fully operational and advertising things in this, but here we are. And there's lots of sites. You probably can't read the y-axis here, but that's 720,000 sites. That's a small number. It means that Let's Encrypt is now the 5th largest CA in business, going from nothing. I think we in Mozilla have something like 120 certificate authorities. They're now number 5. And as you can see from the trajectory of that graph, it's growing somewhat. And the hopes there is that people will now be able to install these wonderful client tools and install and get themselves a certificate. And then we're just down to the last set of problems, which is the fact that your stack breaks occasionally and that people find vulnerabilities in your C library and all of those other wonderful things. And I'm afraid that I don't have an answer for that this evening. So, exercise for the reader. That's all I have. Thank you.